All right, we got a hard maple log up there. It's certainly not the nicest log we've got around here, but that's going to be a rescue, we'll call it, from the firewood pile. I got that log because I'm just learning the Setworks. I got to make sure that I get the learning done on something less desirable than, say, a big log worth money. Now, I have another hard maple over there. It's quite a bit bigger, and we'll get that cut up before long, but we'll start with this thing. Now, assuming you have the log ready to go, it's up here on the log loader. Assuming we load it up onto the sawmill, we'll rotate it as it's needed, we'll clamp it against the log stops, and we'll center the pith if we need to with the toe boards. Once it's in place, ready to go, we're then going to turn up here to the Setworks. We'll turn it on. Obviously, the sawmill would be on. And what we're going to do is we are going to manually set the height that we want the first cut to be at. The first cut will be presumably near the top of the log, and we'll take off a slab. Before we take that slab off, though, we're going to come back to the Setworks at that height we want to cut at, and we're going to press this button. That button there is the Remember Me button, or Remember button. That's going to act as a reference point. That's going to tell the Setworks that we're starting at this cut height, and to reference off of that for any future cuts. So, we're ready to go. Saw's at the right height. We press the Remember button, and then we can go ahead and make the cut. Now, I'm the one controlling how the saw head moves, forward and backwards. The Setworks is going to help me with the up and down. So, down we go. We get to the end of the cut. Obviously, I let off that. The saw stops moving. I can come back and I can press this button, the bump up button. Alternatively, that's the same button right there. And that's going to bump the saw head up just a little, raise the blade just a little, so that I can use the drag back fingers to pull the board back, or the slab in this case, back to my table here. With the saw head back here, I have some choices to make. One choice is I could rotate the log from that first slab 180 degrees so that we start cutting off the opposite side. Alternatively, I can leave the log exactly where it was clamped, and then I can come up here to the keypad and I can input a dimension. Let's say I put in 1.5 inches. Then I hit enter. What's going to happen is the Setworks going to tell the saw head to drop down 1.5 inches, including a kerf, from that initial height, from that reference point. And then we can take a piece off, a piece of lumber, a slab off, and then we can continue that process. Now, assuming that we've cut off all we want to cut off on the one side, on that first side, what we would do at this point is we would rotate the log 180 degrees so that the flat side on the log is now downwards on the sawmill. And what we're going to do at that point is reclamp. Now, once things are reclamped, we can imagine it starts to look something like this. And so what we get to decide is what the board thicknesses are we want to get out of that log. And so we're going to go to the keypad on the Setworks again, and we're going to input the dimensions. Now, we're starting from the bottom, working our way up. We'll put those in one after another. As we put them in one after another, what the Setworks is going to do, it's going to keep a running total on the screen. And so that's going to tell us, based on the inputted dimensions, this is how high the log or how high the first cut is going to be. And basically, you make your way all the way up. And once that running total gets to pretty well where you want the top of the first cut to be, you stop. And then you can press enter, and the saw will begin cutting at that height. And now, once you get to the end, you're going to bump up again. The saw raises up. You can drag back the slab, and then you press enter. Goes down to the next height after that previous cut. Bump up, drag back the board, press enter, drop back down to the next preset dimension. And that process repeats. And then what you're left with on the very bottom, the last piece of lumber, is whatever that dimensional lumber piece was you put in first. You put into the keyboard first. And so that ensures that there's no waste, especially on that bottom piece. You get the dimensions you want all the way to the top. And this thing is what's going to set the height to start each of those cuts with. Now, you won't see it right now, but there's actually a green light that's going to illuminate. It'll flash and then illuminate right in between these arrows. And that's going to tell you when you have the blade set on whatever you programmed. And that's going to make sure you don't cut ahead of time before the sawmill has positioned the blade where it needs to be. Just a little bit of a safeguard for us. One thing I'll mention about the Setworks that is kind of interesting, and I never got a chance to try, but I've heard of people installing these not only on a fully hydraulic mill, an electric mill, but also a manual sawmill before, and I often wondered how that would work. And what it ends up doing is it doesn't actually move the saw head for you if it's a fully manual sawmill, and that makes sense. But what it does do is it tells you where the next cut has to be so that you're not doing any of the math. And I guess what that does is it eliminates errors. And so you would still look at your scale on that manual mill, but this is going to tell you where that next cut has to be. So kind of an interesting thing. I guess this would also, because it gives you that running total, it also would allow you to maximize what material you get out of what log, knowing that you start the cut at the proper height, not lower than that if you wanted a set series of board thicknesses. Well, that's enough talk about the Setworks for now. Let's get this fired up. This is the hydraulic blade tensioner. Oh, little shy. There we go. Lock her in. Well, there we have it, folks. The sawmill is slowly losing its luster, and I don't mean it's not fun anymore. I mean less shiny. If you have a look, it's certainly getting covered in sawdust, and that's the name of the game, so I'm happy about that. That was my very first hardwood log up here. It certainly cuts as well as I would expect. What I need to do at this point is start getting the lumber out of here, load it onto the forks, back into the shed. Likewise, I'll put any slabs that are waste in the slab rack. For now, I think this will have to do in terms of the processing back there. It is not a perfect situation, but it's good enough for now. Once the weather starts cooperating, I'll be able to get something a little more efficient set up. But I think just getting out here, enjoying myself while I'm sawing, learning about the equipment is what I'm after at this point. Now, throwing in the extra Setworks here today, that certainly changed my speed. I was moving slower than normal, but that's because I have to make sure I know what the Setworks is going to do before I do it. And I think what I'm finding with the Setworks is I'm actually using less levers in order to make a cut. So how it's working is I'm essentially setting the log up there, putting the blade where I want the first cut to be, referencing it right there with the Remember Me button, and then I'm making that cut. And instead of using this lever to raise up the saw head like I normally would before dragging it back, what I'm doing is I'm just hitting the bump up button, and that raises it just a little. And then I just pull it back, and what I'm talking about is pulling the lumber back with the slabs with the fingers. And then I come back up here, and I can either press in the dimension of the lumber I want, or assuming it's already there, I just hit enter. And then I repeat the process. Now I'm just going back and forth more or less. Down, once I get to the end and I finish the cut, bump up, back. Once I get to the end, let go, enter. Saw head presumably comes down, go ahead again. Once I get to the end, bump up. And so that's sort of the process that I'm using here, and I just have to get used to it, just like anything else. But as you can imagine, with a brand new sawmill, I have a lot to learn with that alone. So it's going to be a slow go, and I'm okay with that. The thing for me is you got to walk before you can run, and I certainly am not in any shape today anyways to be out running. Anyways, that's going to do it for me here today. I do appreciate you coming out and joining me on this little adventure. I'm going to continue on it and get a few more logs out of the way. We all know that this thing's hungry, so I'll keep feeding it. If you have one of these Mikron Setworks and you have any tips for me or advice, I'd be happy to hear about it down below in the comments. I'm trying to learn the proper way right off the start, and so if there's some things I need to avoid or some things I need to start doing, be sure to give me that info down below, and I would appreciate it. And don't forget, if you did like this video, give it the old like-a-roo and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.